right, so we've talked about speciation, how species go from one species of a population to two separate populations and being different species. So that is the act of becoming new species. Okay, remember, reproductive isolation is the key, whether it's because they live in different areas or something is preventing them from getting to one another. Two populations are not mating anymore, and each separate population will accumulate their own mutations and their own differences over time so that they are physically and characteristically different in the end or in the future. Okay, so today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about what those reproductive isolating mechanisms are. Okay, so again, I'm going to give you some examples. You might want to write down the examples just so that you know or have something to draw on in the future, but you just kind of have kind of the big picture of each of these examples. All right, so keep in mind, reproductive isolation are barriers between species. Okay, remember the definition of a species. You need to look the same, and you need to be capable of breeding naturally and producing fertile offspring. All right, so the offspring have to survive, and they also have to be able to reproduce, and that is what we refer to as a species. Now, once any part of that definition fails, when something is not met, we determine that they are then separate species. And the differences will just get bigger and bigger and bigger over time. Okay, so we prevent reproductive isolation is going to prevent viable offspring, fertile offspring. Okay, so reproductive mechanisms can be broken into two categories. The first is referred to as a pre-zygotic mechanism. Okay, remember when you get a zygote, you have the egg and you have the sperm. They come together to form the zygote. All right, so that two-in cell right at the very beginning of life. So a pre-zygotic means before the zygote forms. So these are things that are going to prevent the egg and the sperm from physically fertilizing. And there's a number of mechanisms or barriers in place that are going to prevent mating from taking place. Okay, it might be that mating just doesn't occur. Okay, so the act doesn't happen. It might mean that the act does happen, but then when the egg and the sperm actually find each other, they don't actually like each other, so they don't fuse to actually form that zygote. All right, so that's all before. Sometimes two separate species can find each other. They can mate, do the physical act. They actually can form babies, but the problem is that the babies may or may not be healthy, or the babies may or may not be able to have babies of their own. And so that is what we refer to as post-zygotic, after the zygote. All right, so we're able to make a zygote, but it's some sort of barrier that is taking place after fertilization that prevents them from being new species. All right, so we're going to start with pre-zygotic mechanisms. So remember, this is before the zygote, preventing the mating, all right, from taking place. So this first one here is referred to as temporal isolation. You might refer to it as like temperature of the atmosphere or something like that. So temporal isolation is that we are isolated by seasons or time of day. Okay, so we see that two separate populations or two separate species don't mate, even if they live right next to each other, or even if they live in the same area and they look very similar. They don't mate because one group might mate in the morning and one group might mate at night, which seems really drastic. But in the life of, for example, fireflies and dragonflies, they only live for about 4 or 5 days. So day and night is a long time for those guys. Okay, all right. Just here's some examples of temporal isolation. So we have the wood frog and the leopard frogs. Again, just frogs, but they are two similar species, and their ranges overlap. So they live in the same area in parts of their ranges overlap, so some of them come in contact with each other, but we find that they don't mate successfully together, and that is because the one on the left is going to breed in the early morning, and the one on the right is going to breed in the afternoon. And so if the eggs aren't ready for the sperm, it's just not going to happen. Okay, another example has to do with the skunks. Okay, we have an eastern spotted skunk and a western spotted skunk. Again, The ranges overlap, so you can find them in the same general area. They look pretty similar. One's a little more dark brown, and one's kind of a blackish color. But because their seasonal reproductive times are different, they can't mate. Again, if the egg's not ready, it doesn't matter what the sperm's doing. Okay. All right. A second type of prezygotic mechanism is something referred to as habitat isolation. Habitat, think of like, where do you live? Okay. So these guys here is that they live in the same geographic area, but their habitats don't overlap. Okay, so what is an example of that? If we take a look at the snakes here, these two types of snakes are going to live in the same general area, but one lives in the water and the other one lives on land. So again, they might be right around here in Great Falls area, but because one spends all its time in the water and one on land, their areas actually don't overlap. And if you don't overlap, you are not going to mate. All right, we also have geographic barriers. Okay. And these are physical barriers. These are kind of the obvious ones, but we've got geographic barriers where these are physical barriers that are going to divide the populations. We see the spotted owls. We have the northern spotted owl and the Mexican spotted owl. If you take a look at them, their ranges are right here. We've got the northern spotted owl right here along the Pacific coast in Washington, Oregon, and Upper California. We have the Mexican spotted owl down here. In Texas and New Mexico, or Arizona, I guess. Arizona and New Mexico, and down into Mexico. And this is all there. So the question is, why don't we see them right here in the middle? And the reason for that is that the Sierra mountain ranges are right here, and the mountain range is high enough that the owls can't cross it. And so over time, as these mountains have grown up, have gotten bigger and bigger and bigger from continental drift and all those other geological forces, it has provided a barrier that have separated these two populations so that they have accumulated their own mutations. There have been instances when they've come back together and they are not mating, so they are separate species. Okay. We also see this with two squirrel species at the Grand Canyon. We've got one on the north rim and one on the south rim. And they have been separated long enough that they do look a little bit different from each other. Not a ton, but a little bit. But because that Grand Canyon is so big and so wide, they're not able to get to each other. Now, they have done some experiments where they've tried to bring them back together and have found that they do not mate with each other. Another example here is that we have a salamander population down here in California. They all started up here in Northern California. And as their population increased, the need for a new area happened, and so they started to migrate more and more south. But we have this Central Valley area right here, which is very dry and deserty types of situations, and salamanders don't do well in that kind of an environment. And so we saw that a group of individuals stayed by the coast. One went more inland, but they both went on opposite sides of that desert area. The ones on the coastline had mutations for the blue color, so they became more and more blue. The ones on the right, looks like we've got some spotted types of coloration, and so those became more and more common. As they met at the base of the valley or base of the desert down here and came back together, again, whoops, didn't know that was going to happen, sorry. As they came back down together towards southern California, they had been separated for long enough and had enough mutations between them that they no longer would mate. Okay, so that's a geographic barrier. My favorite example of a geographic isolation or geographic barrier happens to be with the gorilla species in Africa. Right here we take a look. These are our species. We've got the green right here. We've got the red right here, and we have the bluish over here. This right here is what we call the mountain gorillas. That's the one that we see here in the picture. Take a good look at what this guy looks like. He's got long black fur up here. He's got a nice big black fur or nose here. Kind of comes out a little bit, but he's got the fur that comes down over the eyes. All right. And the mountain gorillas are right here in the blue. They live in, as the name implies, in the higher altitudes. They have long hair to keep them warm in the higher altitudes, shorter arms because they don't need to be doing as much climbing and other things that they need to do. The species name is, or the genus name is gorilla. The species name is Beringi, and the next species is called Beringi. So it's gorilla Beringi Beringi. Now I'm going to show you a picture here. This used to all be a forested area, but through habitat destruction and stuff over many, many years, the only places that we actually see forested areas are in the green, in the red, and in the blue. So all of this right here is opened up dry land, and gorillas do not do well in those situations. And so we've got these barriers here that are preventing the mountain gorilla from reaching these other two populations. And then these two populations are also isolated as well. All right, the second thing, or examples that we have then, is we've got the eastern and the western lowland gorillas. And so we've got the eastern here, western right here in green, and the eastern in the red. The western lowland gorillas are called gorilla. That's my favorite name. And then his cousin would be gorilla gorari. All right, and so they're not considered necessarily separate species yet. Scientists have not. There's still argument out there on whether or not they're separate species, but they do look quite a bit different. The western lowland gorillas, they live in the dense forests, the lowland swamps. Their teeth tend to be fat and whiter. Their jaws are not as strong as the eastern lowland gorilla. They are brown hair versus black hair. You can tell if you compare both of these gorillas with the mountain, their hair is quite a bit shorter. The hair doesn't come down around the eyes anymore. It's up higher. Again, and that's because of the temperature differences. If we look back here, they don't need all of that extra hair around their bodies to keep them warm in the lower areas. Okay, so there's a lot of structural differences that we see between these two populations. They are very close to each other, which tells us that they were not isolated too long ago. All right, we have also some pre-zygotic mechanisms. Remember, pre meaning before fertilization takes place. All right, the first one is referred to as mechanical isolation. Mechanical isolation is showing right here with the with the snails. What we see where the arrows are pointing are the reproductive pores, okay? And so in order for the snails to reproduce, they have to be able to join together. And so they have structural differences that prevent the mating, okay? So the sexual organs are not in the correct place for each other to be able to mate, okay? So the genital arrows, which is where the arrows are not aligned. So if that doesn't work, then you're not going to mate and make babies. Okay. Most oftentimes we see mechanical isolation with flowers. Okay. Different flowers have various structures based on the insects that pollinate them. Some of I think that's my next slide. Yep, there we go. Some flies and moths are structurally adapted to doing these long tube-like flowers where the bees and the flies don't tend to go in there. Bees and flies are going to stay on the other flowers that are more open, catch the pollen, and then go to the next flower over. Okay, so mechanical isolation, they're structurally different. All right, the next one here is for pre-zygotic mechanisms is that the gametes don't like each other. Okay, the gametes don't like each other. So two separate species might find each other. They might actually try to mate, but the egg and sperm don't like each other enough to actually fertilize. Okay, we see this a lot with animals in the ocean. All right, they do something that's called broadcast spawners, as well as do most trees. But they broadcast spawn, so they will go through and send out the sperm into the ocean, and wherever it lands is who they're going to try to fertilize. But if it's not the same species, that new organism is not going to be made. Okay, here's some examples here. This is a picture of a sponge that is sending sperm out into the water in the hopes that it's going to find the same species. This is a tree here that again is sending out a pollen cloud in hopes that it's going to find the same type of tree to land on. Both of these species produce thousands and thousands and thousands of sperm cells with the hope of being able to land on the right kind of plant or animal. Okay. We also have prezygotic mechanisms, which is called behavioral isolation. And this is, we have different courtship rituals. Okay, so this is the blue-footed booby bird. And I have a video, I think, that I'm going to try to show. And that's going to have to be on my second video because I've got about 5 seconds left. So we'll pick this up on video number 2.